What's up, sons? It's Blind Run with Son of a Tech once again, and today I finally have pretty much everything I could think of to cover the Gigabyte AORUS Gaming X470. It's the Ultra Gaming version, so not the higher end levels. This one's going to run you about $139 on Amazon or Newegg, respectively, or both the same price. The question here is it worth it for gaming or mining or even productivity? We're going to talk about some of the features as well as some of the downfalls right after this. Welcome back. So if you take a quick look at the board, you'll find pretty much all of the information that you're going to need here. It's going to be the X470 socket, which will support Zen and Zen Plus CPUs. And it does have, of course, rear output for the display. So you could run a 2200G or a 2400G, and those will boot up just fine on the BIOS that it comes shipped with. There's currently two BIOSes available. You have the F2 and then the F3B. Now the F3B is a beta, which is why I guess you have the B there. And I was hoping it was going to fix some things, but it didn't really fix everything I needed to. This is the final test that we have running back here, and we'll talk about why we have kind of a mining setup as well. But if you're looking at it for gaming or from the gaming perspective, you're going to have a few features that you would pretty much want on here. You're going to have the dual M.2 slots. So both M.2 slots support NVMe, or at least that's what's stated. However, you do need to keep in mind here that any M.2 slots you decide to use will turn off different PCI slots. So that's going to be important depending on what kind of configuration you're going with. It will support 2 cards in Crossfire or 2 cards in SLI. But of course, once again, pay attention to how many lanes you're using and how they communicate with the chip. The manual covers all of this, but you won't be able to do all of it at the exact same time, so you'll have to pick and choose which features you want to actually use there. Now, it does support RGB, which at a price point for this board is awesome. You're going to see RGB with a white LED dedicated, so you're going to get a true white out of it, not just the kind of muddy white that you would get with a standard RGB. So that's pretty awesome, especially on the price point like I mentioned. There is that feature. You are going to support up to 3200 megahertz memory. I have not tested any overclocking right now, but in here at this point is the G.Skill FlareX 3200 megahertz. It noticed it right away. The XMP applied right away. And on the Ryzen 7 2700 that's in there, which you can see a whole bunch of various tests I've done in this playlist up here, it did go ahead and boost that score in Cinebench up quite a bit, as well as helped out a couple seconds in the Blender Ryzen test. So all of that is awesome. You are seeing over 1800 in Cinebench on all cores with the Ryzen 7 2700. More of that will be covered in the 2700 review, and that is also on air with the cooler that comes shipped with the 2700. For CPU power, it is going to require an additional 8 pins, so keep that in mind depending on what power supply you're buying. Pretty much all of them come with an extra or additional 8 pin for the, of course, CPU power, and then you'll need the 24 pin power as well. And other than that, we're going to talk a little bit about what it supports and what it doesn't support. Unfortunately, over here I have the HD60 Pro, and we were trying to run this in some game streams. It will recognize it now. This is the second revision that Elgato sent me for my X370 board when it wasn't being recognized. This one does get recognized, but after about 30 minutes of streaming max, it just kind of locks up and will freeze up OBS and stop streaming, usually locking up the entire computer. I was hoping with X470 this would be resolved. I haven't gotten any information yet, as if to the point of a new BIOS revision, or if that's the beta BIOS, because I didn't test this on the non-beta BIOS, so keep that in mind. It's possible that the PCIe versions of the Elgatos start working. I also have a 4K one, but I haven't tested that one. Most people are going to be looking at this. So at this point, if you are going to be doing content creation and game capture, I highly recommend the HD60S instead, especially if you're going with the X470 or X370 chipset. And that's still going to have lag-free streaming, so you're not going to have any latency with that particular model. There are options. I just like to clarify, the things I find in case you guys are having issues there. Now, as far as mining support, you are going to have one of the best options for CPUs and mining if you're going to want to mine with a CPU in addition to the GPUs that you're running. And that's one of the great things about Ryzen, is it does perform well in CryptoNight. Now, the new CryptoNight heavy algorithm, not so much. So you're going to avoid that with CPU and so on. And that's going to be coins like Sumo Coin. Now, the next thing is, how many cards can it run? Well, there's a little catch there. Remember, I mentioned that deal about the M.2 slots. As soon as you use an M.2 slot, you're going to end up taking away lanes and taking away cards. If you put it in the bottom slot, you're going to lose the 2 bottom cards. So the 2 lanes on the bottom will get taken up, and you won't be able to use either one of those slots. And if you put it in the top one, then the 2x1 slots are going to go away. And the way you would basically do this for SLI is you would put the M.2 slot in the top one, and then you could utilize the 2 reinforced PCIe slots to go ahead and run SLI or Crossfire on those 2 slots there, as well as on the bottom it should work as well. So that's where you would want to install it. But that being said, for mining, if you're going to use an M.2 drive at all to boot off of, then you're going to immediately lose 2 of the PCIe slots, taking you down from 5 GPUs to 3 GPUs. And yes, that also means utilizing an M.2 slot with an adapter for a x1 is immediately out of the question, meaning that the max amount of GPUs that you would be able to ever run on this particular one is 5 GPUs, which I have all 5 lined up here. They were all detected in HiveOS, which actually is attempting to reconnect the VNC server for some reason, but I got my testing out of the way. That's all that really matters. To get this to work, you're going to have to not have an M.2 drive, like I spoke about earlier, and then you're going to need to go into the BIOS and enable above 4G decoding. And then also, as I always recommend, this isn't necessary, but going into your power options and setting AC power back to always on. This means if you turn the power off and back on, it'll turn on by itself. If it loses power and then power is restored, it'll come back, and you don't have to be there physically rebooting it or needing a power button or anything like that. So definitely go ahead and take a look at that. It does support changing the speeds on the PCIe lanes. I tried messing with the M.2 drive installed, and it didn't change anything. The max that we ever got to with an M.2 drive installed was 3 GPUs. And then we had a couple weird issues with it detecting the 5th GPU. After a couple bounces, HiveOS finally picked it up and it was mining just fine. So keep all of that in mind. And I do realize we're using the no-no SATA to 4-pin Molex adapter on that 5th card. It was just what I had to set up, and we're not going to be running it for very long. And it's also a GTX 1050, which in my test, which you can check out in this video up here, the 1050 is less affected because it doesn't use as much power through that PCIe rail as some other cards. So just some cool notes there. Now finally, the biggest downfall with this motherboard, hands down, is going to be the voltage control for the CPU. No matter how we cut this cookie, it's not a good idea to pick this board up. If you're interested in overclocking, especially if you're interested in overclocking within the BIOS and then deciding to utilize maybe something like a Hackintosh or something like Linux even. The reason is because in the BIOS, the only options for overclocking, is the reason I updated to the beta to check, is that it only supports dynamic voltage offset. So there's no manual control to lock those numbers in, and that means that you're going to need to use Ryzen Master to get a true manual overclock where you override that voltage setting, and that means that you're going to have Windows 10 installed and be changing it within that application. And I don't prefer that way of overclocking, especially on an X470 board. If this was B350, something along those lines, I'd be a little bit more lenient on this setting, but this is a reason not to purchase this board. You might want to look at some other options. There are some between that $140 and $160 range that should support that. I believe ASRock has one, and I think there's some coming from Asus soon. They're going to be priced a little bit better down there, and MSI for sure has one as well. I'd go with any of those other options over this Gigabyte at this time, unless they go ahead and get that updated in the BIOS for us to take over control of it. This was all verified in my live streams, and you're always welcome to go rewatch them and just give suggestions if you find anything. All of that being said, the overall look of the AORUS series is awesome for Ryzen. If you're wanting to go with that Ryzen orange, it looks really, really clean and really good. They've toned it down a lot, especially on this board compared to the previous generations of the AORUS boards. And I think that is a very welcome change. There's only some slight orange. There's not like an overwhelming amount of it. And I think when it was orange and white, it was even a little bit more gaudy. So I appreciate this design color-wise over anything else there. Hope this video was helpful. Let me know if you guys have any more questions in the comment section below. Hope we got everything covered. You are going to have support for USB-C. I did want to mention that. Pretty awesome on the board, so you can run USB-C front headers to the newer cases that support it, like of course the Corsair 500p and all of that sort of thing. So it's got pretty much all the connectivity you would need there. It's just one big downfall. I'll see you next Tuesday.